What's up, Grummies? Welcome to Arroyo Office Hours, your source for free cannabis cultivation education. I'm your moderator, Keisha, and we are on episode 116. Shout out to our live viewers on YouTube and Instagram, and to everyone tapping in on Spotify, Apple Music, YouTube, or wherever you listen to your podcast. Thank you so much for your support. If you like the pod, definitely drop us a review because we really appreciate the feedback. Seth and Jason, good to be back in studio with you guys. How you doing?
Good to see you.
Yeah,
you
not
too.
too bad.
Yeah, great. Yeah, we've been out on the roads. Great to be back home. And yeah, let's get into it because the Grammy's been dropping some questions. We got a couple really good ones from Bad Habit over on Instagram. Let me start with this first one. They're looking for tips for finding the balance between keeping your environment exact and overworking your equipment. I find myself wanting to keep closing the gap to keep my environment and VPD perfect, but I'm wondering if you can push this too hard and wind up just making your equipment fight each other, dehu versus humidifier. What do you guys think?
Yeah, so there's a couple of well-known, I don't know if they're tricks, but some equipment just doesn't have it, and that's implementing VFDs, variable frequency drives, on things like blower motors, fans, that type of stuff. And then also using the logic and control in your controllers so that it's not overshooting. A lot of times, if it's just an on or an off option, that equipment's going to go way beyond what it should be doing and push into your dehum. So obviously, it is very equipment dependent. As far as how tight you can keep that, you definitely don't want to be bouncing off of each other because obviously, yeah, that's hard on equipment. You're wasting electricity, and then you're just pushing it, above your set point and below your set point the whole time, right? We want that equipment to be able to ramp down basically as it's approaching that set point, and so that it can hold there for a while. Most of the time, unless you have extremely diverse weather conditions in a greenhouse, you're usually just trying to use one piece of equipment and turn it on and off or ramp it up and down in order to maintain that set point. So example of, if it's hot outside and we're in an indoor, usually we're just seeing our ACs kicking around, right? We're not necessarily having so much fluctuation outside that both pieces of equipment that should be kicking back and forth. So being able to maintain that and then remember the terminology for that equipment algorithm here in just a minute, probably after Seth goes.
Yeah. I mean, step one is figuring out like what can we actually do? For Jason and I, usually what that means is throwing a climate station into a system, a particular grow room, and just observing it with its current set points over time. Obviously, there's times where we say, hey, like this is really bad to begin with. But generally speaking, if someone's been running a system and, actually producing decent cannabis or any cannabis at all, they're somewhat close, and it's more about tightening up these set points and actually identifying, lacking resources and controls. So a lot of times we'll run into a spot where, for example, earlier today, I was talked to two different growers that had the same issue. Their control system didn't allow them to, or currently they didn't have set day and night settings for their humidity. So in the daytime, in this particular case, their LEDs were on all the time. Their plants are transpiring a bunch, and the dehus can't quite keep up. It can't get it down to the set point that they set in the daytime. But during the nighttime, once we get transpiration out of the way and we actually have a decently sized dehu system because it was set up, let's say, for HPS, now they have LEDs, they're actually suffering an issue where they're not, at that point in time, needing to drop their temperature down a lot at night. So our VPD actually goes up. We're seeing like a 1.0, 1.1 in the daytime and then like a 1.6 at night. And while that's, certainly not ideal, it's a set point issue. And diving deeper into that particular problem, what was a common identifier? Like, okay, first step one, let's explore, do we have these set point options in our control system? In one of the cases, no. Okay, so what can we do today, right now? Someone's at the facility every time the lights turn off. We're going to change those set points overnight so they're not over drying the room. And then looking at the future, going, okay, what features and what utilities do we need in our control system to be able to operate this particular room? Because what we're seeing is that it may not actually be out of spec. We just don't have the control capability. Another great example is, we see a lot of people that, hey, my room is I'm growing way more biomass than I ever did before, especially with the HPS to LED upgrade. We're shoving more light into that room, more humidity. And the tendency is to go, hey, let's just double our dehu capacity. Okay, if I've got a small room with a 700 pint dehu, the last thing I want to do is add another 700 pint dehu to it. I probably want to get like 3 220s. That way I can have some controllability and phase that capacity out. So, and by that I mean turning on one piece of equipment at a time to utilize only its portion of the total capacity of the system to keep it inside of a tighter deadband. So assuming you have gone through and exhausted all of these other options, at that point, we're typically looking at, okay, what is your market? You know, when we can't run things inside of a tight deadband and really nail those environmental controls, what we're leaving on the table is production efficiency and quality. So let's say if our VPD is swinging up and down 0.5 every half hour or every 20 minutes, the plant has to adjust to that, and we're losing efficiency over time because we're taking energy away from total production and putting it into adapting to this changing environment. So at that point, usually we're talking about humidity considerations. There are systems we deal with where, you know, temperature and humidity are very tough to control, like Jason said with the greenhouse, compared to the environment that it's built in. That being said, we'll hit certain points where it's time to make a decision. Okay, what is our actual price point in the market? What's our goal here? If we want the best possible quality and the best yield, we need to keep these dead bands really tight. If our market dictates that, hey, we need just yield and not necessarily quite as high of a quality, and by that I mean, you know, THC and various other cannabinoid numbers, and especially terpene numbers, running outside of environmental parameters for long periods of time is going to particularly decrease that component to the final product. And that's where, as a producer, you've really got to look at it and weigh. And if it's a smaller production environment, you know, most of our small producers are shooting to produce grade A top shelf bud. That's where we go, okay, let's look at your price premium difference. You know, a popular one out there lately, Jealousy and Lemon Cherry Gelato, we're looking at like a $300 a pound premium on whether or not you can get that bud purple. Okay, if it's, you know, 30+% of the total price premium that we're attaining by getting purple versus not purple, let's pull some plants out of the room so we can actually push those temperatures and maintain the parameters that we know we need to hit that consistently every time.
Yeah, and Chris, maybe if you want to open up my screen sharing here, I have a good diagram of PIDs was the terminology I was looking for, and that's proportional integral differential control type programming. And if you have a decent control system, that should be an option that you are utilizing for sure. And what I did here on this diagram was draw basically, in this case, maybe I'm going to talk about heaters and ACs versus dehums and humidifiers, but same principle exactly. Where in this case, let's say the purple line that we're looking at is swinging without a PID control, and in this case, all right, when that purple line crosses my blue line here, that's when our AC unit is going to turn on. Well, our AC unit actually runs too long, for example, and then it pushes that temperature down below our heating set point here, where the purple line crosses the red line, right? And then it kind of bounces back and forth. Sometimes it stabilizes, sometimes it doesn't stabilize, depending on the external influential factors, i.e., how hot it is outside, how many lights you have running, other types of HVAC componentry. On this picture here, this curved red line is actually after a PID implementation, where we can see, in this case, all right, our heater is curbed before we actually even hit that set point. And so the room is still heating up, right? It takes an amount of energy and time for that room to get up to the temperature of our input of heat, of energy. And so if that cuts out at the right time, then we're not overshooting our target point. So if you have a decent HVAC control system and you're not using PIDs in there, talk to your HVAC control technician, your building management guy, and see if it's something you can utilize. If you don't have that option and you really are shooting for top quality product and are tired of fighting big dead bands between your set points, then consider getting some fresh upgrades as far as control systems go.
Yeah, and if you look over time at Most growers in a particular system, if you're struggling with environmental control, you've hit either a yield ceiling, a quality ceiling, or you have a persistent problem like bud rot or mold. And usually when I sit down with the grower and we break down either how much they're losing from disease issues or where their yield cap is in being able to maintain any of these set points and not suffer negative effects on the crop, it quickly becomes apparent that, the yield and quality gains that can be realized by investing in a better control system, especially if you're at a point where you're like, hey, I've got a dehue on the wall or on the ceiling rather, and I've got a humidistat on the wall. That's all that's controlling it, and I'm in there constantly adjusting it. Once you factor in your time, the potential yield losses, and then just right to what Jason was sharing, when you see that line go outside of both of those parameters, now we're looking at a time where the plant's outside of its optimum efficiency operating range. So like outside of those set points, if you cumulatively look at, hey, I've spent, let's say 42 days total outside of my humidity set point on the lower end, I know that I didn't have a high enough VPD to drive enough transpiration to really optimize like the total potential yield of that crop. I was below that set point, and that's a very important set point. Or I was swinging above and below too often, so the plant cumulatively spent an incredibly long amount of time outside of that set point, and we actually lost total production efficiency as a result. And sometimes that might mean 5 grams a square foot that we're really dialing in the last 95 to 100 grams, let's say, or 100 to 105, or it might be more like, hey, we have to get these set points in range just to get you up to that like 50 to 60 grams per square foot basis, because right now you're spending so much total time outside of all of these parameters that the plants are just not growing as fast as they could.
And actually, a great calculation in the Arroyo software itself, if you go into your harvest group analytics, it'll tell you how much time you spent out of your set target ranges, right? And I always like to think about that as a projectability, right? I know how much yield and probably the quality I have based on the set or the targets that I have set in Arroyo, and the greater the amount of time outside of those targets, the less likeliness that I'm going to be exactly on target with what I want to or with what I expect as far as yield and quality out of that run.
Yeah, I think an important thing to talk about now is the fact that if you don't have all of your different factors, both environmental and substrate in play and dialed in, you're leaving efficiency on the table. So if, for instance, we're looking at upgrading a room from HPS to LED, I always recommend that people reinvest in looking at, hey, how much DHU and AC capacity do I have, and how well can I actually control this room? Because with the HPS, if you're already at the limits of your DHU capacity, we know that we're about to shove way more light into that room and drive a lot more transpiration. So pragmatically, maybe we should upgrade the DHUs, because if we put money into the LEDs immediately, we're not going to be able to actually utilize all the advantages that they have to offer. And when we're talking about LEDs, yes, there's power savings, but we also get a more uniform distribution of higher intensity light, which allows us to grow more biomass inside of the same space. So if I'm only upgrading for power, I'm going to be running those LEDs way down at 50 or 60% to keep my humidity in check, possibly lower, or pulling plants out. Whereas if I had organized just that purchase a little better and said, hey, I'm going to make my environment ready for this change and be able to accommodate it, then I can hit the ground running and actually realize the gains from implementing, let's say, 30% more photons into my grow space.
Yeah, I kind of wanted to also just emphasize what Seth was talking about with when we are bouncing off set points or going beyond those, and the faster that we see changes in the room, typically the more energy that's lost into that plant. And this is where time series data is extraordinarily valuable for tailoring in HVAC systems. And the reason is because, if we're using, say, like a daytime average to evaluate the efficiency or the quality of our HVAC systems, then we might be missing the mark. Let's say that we're bouncing off of a 6-7 degree temperature difference high to low, and maybe it's doing that 20 times a day. That's not allowing the plant to acclimate to that environment. And maybe even if we tighten that down to say 5 degrees, still the more that we're bouncing up and down, the less efficient those plants are going to grow. So it'd be better to stabilize close to your set point rather than trying to really pinpoint it exactly and then be bouncing around.
Yeah, it's important to remember technology can move way faster than plants, it turns out. And sometimes it really just is those set points and little bits of control. Like Jason brought up VFDs earlier. Do those cost a lot more than super basic manual controls? Absolutely. Are you going to be able to realize a lot better control and over time, a lot better results from utilizing the slightly more expensive technology? Also, absolutely.
Man, you guys, thank you. A wealth of knowledge in that answer. Outstanding. All right. Well, bad habit, you got an answer to your first question. Let's dig into your second one. They want to know tips for rooting in 4x4 cubes on top of 1-gallon cocoa bags, or just transitioning from vegging in wool to flowering in cocoa in general. And I know we've been talking about rooting in recent episodes. So what do y'all advise for bad habit?
Yeah, we've talked about rooting in quite a bit in the show, and there's a good reason for it because it's something that is absolutely vital to making sure that you're getting as fast a growth as possible, making sure that your plants are ready and rooted to do the types of crop steering that we want for top yield, top strain quality, all that stuff. And so when we think about the physics and the physiology of what's happening in that plant during transplant, we want to make sure that we are not oversaturating either of the substrates, because then we get some root stagnation. So typically we're talking about doing a few very small irrigations on a daily basis. That's getting us fresh oxygen, fresh nutrients. We definitely don't want our total water content for the day to go up, right? So we're looking for a decrease in that on a day-to-day basis. And typically, as things keep rooting in faster, as the plant gets bigger, we're going to see the derivative, how quickly that water content decreases, that derivative is going to get larger, right? So we're losing more water content on a daily basis until we hit a specific amount of water content. And that's kind of our, our SOP for this plant is now well rooted in, right? When we hit a certain transpiration rate that we're looking at in the lower substrate, we know that the plant is pulling substantial amount of water out of it. And this is really critical when we're working with two different media types as well, because we want to make sure that those roots are coming out of that rock wool and going into the cocoa.
So that's trying to draw a nice little demonstration here. But I think the important thing to remember here is when we're looking at what actually drives root development and causes those roots to grow down into a space, there's a few factors. Number one, if it's oversaturated, they're going to get what we call lazy and just not seek out that water source because they already have access to it way up at the top. So we don't want to oversaturate. And that also leads to problems with your media going anaerobic and promoting bacterial infection, fungal infection, all sorts of fun things that we don't want. So we're looking at that rooting in period, whether it's cocoa or rock wool. Typically, we're wanting to start, way up at field capacity. And then what we're looking at doing is giving very small, 1% or so shots. So minute and a half feeds once a day on that first day just to push water through. And then on those following days, what we're doing is pushing, anywhere from 3 to 6 shots evenly distributed throughout the day through at that very tiny 1 or less percent, because what we want to see is this total water content fall. And the reason for that is because if we look at what's going on with just basic soil physics here, if we have a pot, we've got a lot of water content in that pot, but there's a certain point at which gravity is going to force there to be a higher amount of water content. So more crayon drawings here, always fun. But basically the other part about this is plants have adapted to this reality in soil, right? Like they but adaptationally will seek out and they actually absorb water mostly in the tips of the roots. So what we want to see with that rooting in period is that we're taking this top media here, which I didn't draw, unfortunately, and we're keeping that just hydrated enough that it's not drying out, and we're actually pushing water flow through it. And that promotes downward root growth. And when we see this overall 15 to 25% dryback from initial hydration on our other graph here, then we know, because we're actually putting the sensor here. We'll draw a sensor.
On the sensor, I was going to draw the top pot.
There we go. Yeah, that's a bad looking sensor, but we'll call it a sensor.
And then I was going to draw the drippers in here too,
You could do that.
because we
Draw some
definitely
roots.
want to make sure that they're up here during this process.
Yes, we
who's
want
got the
those
plant?
drippers to be in the top pot. Let's
Oh, we don't
definitely
have a green
highlight that.
marker.
No, that's okay. Our roots are black today. They shouldn't be in real life. But what we want to see is we've got that sensor down here in the suspended water column, and that's the water we want the plant to be accessing. That tells us it's properly rooted in because the roots had to go from this top block all the way down to this reservoir of water to actually access it and start pulling that VWC reading down in the area that we're sensing. So that's part of why we always push that big initial dryback, but continued pulsing. And that's right back to what we were talking about before, controls. When it comes to irrigation, investing in a system and building one that allows you to have as much control as you want is often important because, I mean, I know with plenty of clients that I work at, we're all at the mercy of the market. We don't get to choose necessarily how many strains we want to grow, which strains we want to grow, and building a system that can accommodate, hey, I'm running a stacked media. Someone wants to run a 1 gallon clone straight into the bag media setup. You've got to be able to adapt to whatever. And the end result of building your system out to be adaptive and robust is any operator having an easier job, ultimately.
That's facts right there. Awesome. Thank you guys for that. We just dropped in the chat an education guide on rooting in best practices. In case that's helpful, got to get your rooting in right. Wonderful. Well, we're going to keep it moving. And actually, we got on the subject of irrigation, we got a great question in from Instagram. This person wrote, when irrigating small rock wool blocks, 1,500 milliliters, full cycle, does it make sense to run smaller, very frequent shots to better replenish the block during P1?
So yeah, with your small media, you're going to be pretty limited on how big of a shot you can put on percentage wise. And that's what you'll have to do is increase the number of shots. And then for your frequency, just watch to make sure that you're not getting any channeling until you've achieved field capacity. And that's where it gets a little tricky. Hopefully you do have access to some sort of substrate sensor where you can establish, hey, have I actually hit field capacity? Because when we're dealing with a small media, it's very easy to put a big enough shot on to actually promote some channeling. And at that point, we might be looking at, hey, on the smaller rock wool media, we only want to put on, a 1 to 3% or maybe up to a 5% maximum shot. And then by watching how it responds to that initial P1 irrigation, let's say starting at 15 minutes between shots, okay, do we get any channeling or any runoff before we actually hit that 65 to 70%? That should be our field capacity. And if so, that just means we're putting on too much water too quickly.
Yeah, and I'm going to keep pushing on our irrigation calculator that we talked about just the other day, because this is just a super awesome tool for helping you evaluate how big of shots, how many shots you want, and how to space stuff out. So we were talking about just 0.1s. I set this up for 0.3 gallon per hour drippers, 2 per substrate, and then in this case I did 1,030. If we wanted to do exactly your 1,500 milliliters, we'll just go into custom here. We'll talk about just pushing these numbers around until you're in a place that doesn't have too much runoff. And super easy conversation when we just have P1s, because we can know that what yesterday's dryback was. Obviously, let's say we were at 25% dryback yesterday and we want about 5% runoff. Well, this setup here would give us exactly that. We can see our total P1s at 30.24%, total daily volume at 30.24%, because we don't have any P2s in the situation that you're talking about here. And sure, we could do 480 second shots, or we could break this down and do 8 120 second shots. Obviously have the same result. So check this tool out. Everyone that I've showed it to is bookmarked it and is using it on a semi-daily basis.
It's way easier than the spreadsheets we used to show.
Yeah, it's way better, yeah.
It's so good. We just dropped it in the chat. If you are listening elsewhere, you pull it up with irrigation-calculator.arroyo.io. Get into it.
I did some bad math there. I meant to say 90 second shots, not half of 180. It's 120. Oops.
What did you say? Half of 180?
Yeah. All good.
Got to keep you thinking.
Same math.
This is why you should use the calculator and not your brain.
Exactly.
Awesome, you guys. Thank you for that. Shout out to our Gromy who asked that question. Good luck. Keep us posted. All right. Well, speaking of keeping us posted, our Gromy Danny dropped an update here and a question on YouTube. He writes, I have an update about my pH rising issue. Found out the old nutrients that I didn't want to throw away have humic acid in part A. So should I worry about runoff rising to about 6.5? My only other gas I use is potassium bicarbonate, but didn't cause this issue with the other cocoa specific nutrient. What do you guys think?
Well, I think the place to start the conversation there is what does pH mean in terms of plant health, and what are we most paying attention to? So when we look at that chart that we've showed before on the show that, logs plant nutrient availability versus pH in the nutrient solution, as we go below, especially 5.0, we see significant restriction on all nutrients. As we're drifting higher and we get to that 6.5 or higher level, then we start to see a little bit of restriction in our micros, but not necessarily the macros. So if our runoff's hitting, a 6.0 to a 6.5, is that what we want to see? Not necessarily, because we really like to see that, 0.1 to 0.2 to 0.3 drop in pH between input and runoff as an indicator that those plants are pulling out all of the negative, well, not all of, but plenty of the negative ions that we put in. With the pH drifting up, as long as we're not approaching a 7, we don't really worry about it too much, especially until later flower, at which point we're really, really wanting some of those micros. So I think that's one of the things to really consider here when you're worrying about pH and correcting it is the particular pH I'm at, what are the downsides of this? And working backwards, sometimes, especially growing in cocoa, one thing I've observed over the years is a lot of cocoa will come with a high sodium content that can throw the pH off in your initial hydration. So understanding, hey, what am I working with from the beginning? Because, for example, I've had plenty of cocoa come in that at initial hydration will run off at 6.5 to 7.5. Is that an issue? Not necessarily as much in veg and super early flower. And I'm not going to be able to put on enough irrigation to correct that until I actually get into flower and run a lot of P1 cycles to push enough volume through to actually correct that pH. That being said, if I get a cocoa block that I initially hydrate and it runs off at let's say 1.5, 2.0 EC and 4.5 pH, I know I have to buffer that, wash and buffer potentially, in order to plant in it, because at 4.5 pH, my clones are all going to not really perform very well. They're not going to be able to uptake nutrients, and it's not going to be a good start. Whereas that 6.5 pH, is that great? Not necessarily, but it's not nearly as detrimental as having the 4.5 pH. Those plants will still be able to uptake nitrogen, potassium, and phosphate at a very reasonable level at 6.5.
You guys have seen the charts before. I was pulling them up.
Yeah.
Just make sure that you are looking at the one that's specific to the substrate that you're in. This one that I found real quick, I don't know that it's for cocoa. This other one, this might be for cocoa. A couple of them vary a little bit as well. So try and find a reputable source when you are looking at these. And again, I reiterate, make sure you get one specific for your substrate. When we're looking at these in regards to soil, a lot of times that pH is going to be closer to 7 when we're looking at it. If we're looking at rock wool, it's typically going to be down closer to 5.5 for those absorption rates.
That's a good point, Jason. Remember, we're doing hydroponics, not soil growing here. So if you just go generally look for this information, you do want to steer yourself in the right direction, because if we talk about field agriculture and existing native soils and stuff, the chemistry changes a little bit depending on particle size and different buffering compounds that may be present in that particular soil, which is something that as indoor and greenhouse growers growing in soilless media, we don't typically encounter, but there are plenty of growers out there trying to use a soilless mix that mimics more natural and living soil, and these values change a little bit.
All right. Thank you guys for that. Danny, thank you for your question. We love the follow-up, so keep us posted. All right, we're going to keep it moving here. I'm going to head over to Instagram. We got a live question here from someone who wants to know, based on crop steering, first few weeks in flower, use higher light intensity and cooler temp, but bulking, use lower light intensity and hotter temp. Shouldn't bulking want stronger light? That makes sense.
So generally speaking, let's just talk about what light's doing for the plant. So that's driving photosynthesis and bulk production, right? If we're looking at the life cycle of this plant as, hey, our profitable growing time is, let's say, 56 or 63 days, each one of those days is greater than 1% of that plant's life. That's pretty appreciable in terms of what's going on there. So if we want to produce the most flower possible and produce the best flower we can, that means we have to maintain all of our environmental parameters and also get the most amount of light, pull out the most amount of humidity, and get the right amount of heat into these plants to be able to produce the metabolism that's going to lead to what we need to grow. So what that means is we always want to, in the veg time we have, try to get those plants up to a fairly high ppfd range, as much as they'll tolerate. And inside of a, more modern day veg cycle of 2 to 3 weeks, 550 to 600 ppfd is about where we'll hit there. And that means we're going to hit that flower room at more like 750 to 800 ppfd and try to get up to our 1,000 to 1,200 very quickly. And the reason for that is that plant has to adapt by building up more and more chloroplasts as it builds new tissue to handle that more intense light. So we have to ramp it up just a little bit. But during generative growth, there's, a fairly interesting thing at play where we're trying to give the plant super optimal growth conditions, but we're using the application of water and the timing of that to essentially steer it more towards a water scarcity response, which means it's going to grow shorter. It's going to put more energy into producing nodes rather than growing longer in between the internode spaces. Now, that cold is part of that. So if we can maintain optimal heat, usually 80, 82 degrees leaf surface temp, throughout those first 3 weeks, we're getting the maximum amount of metabolism. And by using our generative irrigation strategy to really close down that window and not introduce a lot of root respiration throughout the day, just in our targeted time, what we're doing is encouraging that plant, through basically hormonal manipulation at this point, to divide and make more cells rather than stretch out the cells in those internode space. And that's ultimately what we want. We have talked a lot about shortening of overall plant stature by controlling that stretch, but the goal there is that we're actually shifting those stretching resources into more node and therefore more bud production. So it's always a balance between optimizing plant nutrition and environment and then introducing what's often referred to as stress strategically to really steer that plant morphology. But the reality is, when we're running generative steering strategies with specifically irrigation, but also the environment, at 80 to 82 degrees, that's where plants grow best. At, the 0.9 to 1.1 VPD, we see great veg type growth. And we want to encourage that as much as possible because we're trying to optimize every phase to really get this yield and not slow the plant down. But again, just steering it. That's where this whole term comes from. So if you take the heat out of the equation early on, you're going to have a shorter plant, but not necessarily increase that node count and therefore increase your yield. So that's one thing that's kind of weird to wrap your mind around is we're stressing plants, but not really. We're more like tricking them. So in those first 3 weeks, we're saying, hey, you're only getting some water in the morning. When we get to bulking, somehow we've tricked the plant into thinking that it's both raining and sunny all day. So grow. And then when we go back into generative, we're saying, hey, it's coming into late summer. The rain's let up a little bit and it's time to start finishing up.
I think the key word there is balancing, right? Even though we talk about these phases as, a generative or a vegetative phase, most of the time that's specific to the irrigation patterns that we're giving. A lot of times we're actually offsetting that with the environment, just as you were saying. We when we're trying to balance quality and yield, we have to balance how quickly the plant is growing and how quickly that we're developing bud sites.
All right.
I want to say though, Keisha, it all comes back to crop registration. Take pictures and take notes, because if you don't, it's going to be hard to replicate what happened that time. And there's plenty of examples of someone messing up and actually producing a better result just because we see such variability. Part of what keeps us fun, right?
Part of what keeps us fun. Absolutely. But yeah, crop registration, we say it every episode. take those notes and take those pictures.
Yeah, I think
Very
this is
important.
one of the reasons that so many people really enjoy developing new strains is because you don't know how to grow it best until you're on run 3, 5, 10, 20. The ability to see progression and start to read how that plant reacted to your base growing conditions is a really unique and fun experience.
My favorite is forgot to change my irrigation schedule for a week. So I
Nice.
accidentally ran generative 28 instead of 21 days. And then like, whoa, this particular strain responded amazingly to that. It's, the stretch is way better. My nugs look way better. Like, okay, well, right back to there. If maybe that was the 8th time we ran that strain, but we had taken a little better notes the first 7 times, we might have already realized that was something that needed to happen.
I was working with just an exceptional grower. I don't know, this was probably a year ago, and they goofed up, and he's like, man, this run blew it away. Like and he literally named it Golden Recipe at that point for that strain. I was like, sweet, man. I mean, like, sometimes accidents are happy.
Mm-hmm.
Most of the time not, though.
Well, and we can learn off of every single run, right? Like that's one of the cool things. As long as you're taking notes, there's something there to learn. Perfection for one strain is absolutely not perfection for another one. And there's kind of only one way to find out.
Yeah. The worst case is if something changed and you don't have enough documentation or records to know how you ended up with the better product that time.
Yeah, that's probably scarier than anything. So when you can't replicate it. So
that's it, y'all. Thank you so much for that. Okay. Speaking of stretch, we got this question from our Gromy Ian on YouTube, and there's been a lovely conversation happening. So let me share the question with you guys. He writes, in stretch, is the purpose of high substrate EC to limit stretch and force the plant to focus on bud site development? Does this high EC have any other advantages? I ask because we're having trouble getting the substrate EC up high enough with MAC 1. It is currently day 7. Since MAC 1 doesn't stretch much anyway, I was thinking maybe we don't need to worry. What do you guys think?
Yes. I mean, generally, you're right on as far as, why we are allowing that substrate EC to climb up. We're reducing the osmotic differential between the plant and the substrate. The other side effect there is with a higher EC, a lot of times we are seeing, faster bud site development because we are allowing that plant to transition its hormone balance into a more reproductive type of growth. So basically, we're trying to activate what's called progenitor cells in the plant and develop those reproductive sites on the plant. So not only is it to limit stretch, but it's also to get that hormone balance in check.
Yeah, part of the discussion here, I think, too, is what is high EC? What kind of light source are you growing under? If we talk to people who have grown a little more traditionally with, maybe not the best environmental control and just 1,000 watt HPS, they were used to growing in a 2 to 4 EC range. Part of that EC stack is the exertion of osmotic pressure. Absolutely. Another part of it is that when we have plants under 11 to 1400 ppfd, a very controlled VPD environment, and we have enough CO2 to support that, those plants actually do feed fairly aggressively. For instance, if you've been feeding this MAC at, let's say, a 3.0, and you have been pushing a fair amount of runoff, or you ran a 2.0 in veg in the same pot, and now you're in flower trying to stack it starting from a lower base. If those plants are seeing 1100 plus ppfd, typically once that root zone EC drifts below a 4.0, we're seeing quite a few signs of deficiency in the plant. And one frustrating thing about that is it will start as light yellowing and then start to look at total deficiency. And when we're talking about hydroponic systems in general, if we go back to some of the more basic systems in the past, like deep water culture, part of that operation was, hey, we're giving the plants more nutrients than they actually need in this particular setting. Nitrate is one that we really want to watch and monitor, so we're not letting that overpower everything else essentially. But the plants typically only take up what they actually need out of that solution. So if you give your plants a 3.0 and they're going to feed, that's 1500 ppm, and they're going to feed 500 ppm that day, they're not going to feed more because you put more in. But if you didn't put enough in, you're going to see some negative results from that. And once we blow this up to a bigger scale where we're trying to operate more efficiently, we can't go back to, I always love to joke about this tech I got, I think it was from IC Mag like 13 years ago. It was the first time I grew with cocoa. It was a 1 gallon pot, mix up a 5 gallon bucket with your nutrient solution, and every day pull your plant out of the tent and dunk it in that pot till it stops bubbling. And I thought that was really cool because that gave me total control over my EC and pH in that root zone. But it was incredibly expensive and not something that would ever translate to commercial production, especially when we look at things like IPM and biosecurity, cleanliness. So there's a few things to weigh there, but high EC, I think it's really important to establish what that is and then what the benefit you're getting out of it. Because right back to what Jason said about balance, it's really easy to chase specific numbers in your system, but realistically, there's quite a few different numbers that are all interrelated. And if you're focused too much on, let's say, driving higher EC by cutting your runoff, you're going, hey, I'm just going to really reduce my runoff to almost nothing for the next week. Well, you kind of ignored probably what's going on with your pH. And then when you go to get a pH sample, that might have drifted down. So by chasing the EC number and sacrificing your pH, you probably did more damage than what getting that extra point or two of EC would have done for you. And if you missed, if you don't have time series data to see that, like, hey, I can watch this plant feed and pull that EC out overnight, then it might be kind of hard hit and miss to get to the solution, which at that point would be to feed a higher EC if that's what your plant demands.
The old redneck flood and drain system, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's very much what that is. It's messy. I wouldn't recommend it.
Yeah. And one of the interesting things here is obviously, we don't sell nutrients. We don't sell anybody specific nutrients, but a lot of times we do end up working with clients that are they're just at too low a EC, whether it's pushing too much runoff, just not feeding enough. Traditionally, in traditional horticulture, nothing but cannabis really enjoys being fed at the levels that we're seeing in today's high intensity cannabis grow productions. And so, without necessarily using a full feedback system and looking at what the substrate EC is, it's a little bit harder to try and tailor exactly how much runoff you want, how you're irrigating, and how much EC you want in your feed systems.
Yeah, that's a good point. And actually, I want to tag on to that. There are quite a number of crops that do enjoy high EC.
This high?
Yeah.
What you got?
You can talk to some tomato and cucumber guys, peppers.
All right.
That will run, feed ECs.
Oh, okay.
They'll run even higher feed ECs. But, the primary thing there is what we're looking at is in traditional agriculture, specifically food, the profit margins are such that we're always looking for what's the best I can get out of the least input. And cannabis is one of the few crops where we can actually approach it from the other end, which is honestly what brought me out of traditional horticulture and into cannabis. Cause hey, in a production facility, we can actually push results that outside of this, we would see in crazy high-end research facilities, because that's basically what almost everyone's built for their cannabis facility.
That's real. Wonderful. Okay. Thank you guys for that. Thank you, Ian, for your question. We're going to keep it moving here. This is a good one we got from another Jason. This one is on YouTube. They want to know the best way to add oxygen to feed water. We are adding H2O2 daily. And I misspoke. This is the conversation that's happening in the chat. We've got some commentary here that H2O2 was maybe not working that great, trying hypochlorous acid instead. So what do you guys think?
Yeah, I mean, there's a good number of ways to do it. Obviously, your solution there is a chemical solution. Probably I'm going to start off with the basics, and that's making sure that we have a good temperature for our batch tanks or our source water. And that's typically, looking at that 66 degrees range. Naturally, the cooler a liquid is, the more soluble gases are in it, right? So dissolved oxygen is the oxygen gas in that liquid. our fertigation water. So, ways to do increase dissolved oxygen chemically. Yes, hypochlorous acid, hydrogen peroxide. Those are both ways to do it. I like having some amount of hypochlorous acid injection. There are ways to manually have oxygen injected in there as well. And, we're thinking about things like waterfalls, right? Bubblers. Let's put an air stone in the tank. And then there's commercial solutions like nano bubblers. Most of the time, those aren't necessarily required, but it's all going to depend on what levels you're floating at natively in your system.
Yeah, I mean, I think the big thing there is it's all temperature based. At the end of the day, I can dump H2O2 or hypochlorous into my 75-degree water, and boy, I better water immediately, because that oxygen's just going to gas off over time as well. At 75 degrees, the water won't hold on to that oxygen. So if you're looking at, okay, what's a today solution? Yeah, running hypochlorous, especially if your water's over 70 degrees, because you've probably started to build up some biofilm, especially in your lines on the tables or anywhere that the water actually does get up close to 80 degrees. That being said, just like Jason said, there are a number of solutions on the market to cool your water. And one cool thing about things like water chillers and stuff, that circulation can actually be used to inject that oxygen as well. Once that water's down to 65, it really doesn't need to be any more complicated than what they do at fish hatcheries, which is dump it down a giant column filled with different sized tumblers to basically mix up the water. It's just like smaller bubbles in your bong. That's really all we want, is lots of little bubbles and that water to be cold so it stays in there. You can chase your tail a long time, but getting that water cool and actually ensuring that the water goes onto the plants at that temperature as well, 65, 66 degrees is going to keep your lines cleaner, keep your water more well oxygenated. And then that hypochlorous is, that's my favorite over H2O2, because it also seems to help with keeping nutrients dissolved better for longer periods of time as well. Good housekeeping protocol, I would say.
So Ian just dropped this update. We are using a Solus hypochlorous acid now instead of Athena. I just checked and we only switched on Monday. Our substrate EC has been going up since then.
Without looking at things like runoff volumes, it would be tough to say that switching your hypochlorous would do anything to your root zone EC beyond that.
Yeah, and I always like to think, I love Mountain Dew. And so I always like to think of, the simple physics of dissolving gases into liquids as a carbonated drink, right? When a warm soda or warm cola is going to go flat much faster than a nice iced or cold cola.
That's a great example.
Wonderful. You guys rock. Okay, we're going to keep going. We now have a question with a visual aid. This one came from Chili Wolf. They wrote, I have found this cocoa medium, and they make it a pyramid shape medium. It's 4.5 liters volume with a volumetric water content of around 68%. I remember Seth saying in an episode that this shape would be a great shape for root growth. My question is, where would you mount the sensor on such a block? Where its sides are angled, I'm assuming it's likely to be a bit of play and find out.
Yeah, so play and find out's going to be the best way. We got a good process for you to play and find out.
As I say, I got some of those at my house. I wanted to play with them too. I could tell you what to do.
Did you find where it goes?
Yeah, I got my proxim out 1.25 inches up, and then I flipped the sensor around backwards and kind of scraped in there with a knife. Just cut out a little shelves so I could seat the sensor all the way in at 1.25 inches up.
I like it. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think those are actually a really, really neat product. I would love to actually go see how they're made to understand how they get it to hold that shape. And in a commercial setting, I'd love to be able to afford to get, 2,000 or 10,000 of those shipped to me. Those would be some pretty big pallets. But I'd love to hear how you feel about that media. I think they're super cool, but they do have that one caveat, and I just used a box cutter to scrape that out. A box cutter and a spoon if you want to get real advanced there.
Nice. Yeah. And one of the things that you can do yourself, just to kind of double check that you are doing it probably in a reasonable way, is bring it up to field capacity and see what the water weight is, right? So weigh it before you put any water in it, weigh it after, it's started running off. Just once there's no more runoff, weigh it, subtract your dry weight, and you'll have how much water it held. And does that water percentage roughly equal what you're seeing from your sensor? That's super easy check, works with any type of media. You may have to play around with the installation a little bit. I love the idea of getting that shelf in there, because obviously when we're thinking about how is it installed.
You could draw, yeah.
Oh, I just smeared everything. You draw a pyramid, I'll draw a pyramid.
That's the problem with whiteboards.
Right.
Oh, hey.
We actually had one today.
Hooked it up here.
Yeah. There you go. Here's where your sensor goes in.
Because we always like our prongs to be, horizontal. So we have
it maybe looks more like a UFO.
Got a little bit crooked here. Should we just make a big one?
Yeah. There you go. Here, I'll draw this part in red.
You draw that part in red.
There we go.
So I'm going to draw a sensor over here showing how we don't like the prongs, and then we'll have some black prongs over here. So, yes.
That's not a sensor. Just little aliens hanging out.
This is Seth's awesome and creative way of getting this installed. He's just carved out a little shelf, as he called it. This way we're getting those prongs nice and horizontal into the substrate. He said an inch and a quarter up.
Yep, inch and a quarter up.
I think that's what we use for
pretty
traditional
standard
1 gallon, 2 gallon medias. And go right in there. Obviously, if you don't end up carving that in and you want your sensor fully flush, it's going to end up like this, which typically doesn't give us nearly as consistent of readings as this water's passing through the block.
Yeah, and I honestly couldn't say how having it not only reading at a gradient, but at like a 45 versus vertical, what kind of reading, how that would throw it off. Vertical is one thing because we're sensing a really regular gradient, not a angled cross section of gradients.
Yeah, and usually anytime that the prongs are more vertically entered over horizontally entered, typically we just see less dynamics, right? Because as we're talking about that gradient, there we go. Oh, yeah, we could use blue. Now we're getting crazy, guys. All right. So see how we've got more blue lines that they're closer together down towards the bottom. That's because we have greater water density. Well, the water's not more dense, but the substrate's more dense with water as we get towards the lower. When we have a horizontal here, we're reading this patch of water. And as our irrigation goes through, it's typically going to give us higher and lower water contents as we're seeing that water progress through there. Whereas if we're vertical like this, for example, we're going to be reading a larger area or larger volume that has more different amounts of water content.
I should pull up some data from the early prototypes that were reading Hugo's vertically sometime. Those are pretty fun to watch the water go up and down real quick.
Yeah, I could probably find some.
But yeah, I'd love to hear how these turn out for you. I've only grown in them once. They're okay. I'll say my only comment was they were a little interesting to get hydrated compared to the way I'm used to doing cocoa bags. So there's a little patience exercise.
Dunk and hold.
I didn't dunk them because I wasn't totally sure they wouldn't fall apart. I followed the directions, which is to hydrate in place and then move your little starter block and stack on top of it. So I just stuck drippers into it per directions and hydrated it that way.
Yeah, interesting. I don't know if I've seen them in cocoa, but I have, phenolic medias?
Oh, yeah.
That sometimes come that way as well.
Yeah, this it's really interesting. I'd love to see how your luck goes with them.
That was fun.
Oh, also though, on the shape part, theoretically, yes, that's maximizing the area of that suspended water column, which is where our effective water content is for plant growth. It's very comparable to the reason that we're always preaching about a 4x4x4 stacked on top of a 36-inch slab, all about maximizing water content in the physical area that the plant can actually utilize it.
Awesome. Chili Wolf, thank you so much for that question and that visual aid. It's a really cool looking substrate. It's going to be cool to see how the plants take to it. All right. All right. We got 5 minutes left in the show and I got announcements, y'all. But we got this question in specifically to you, Jason. Came from Dom. They wrote, what specs should I look for on supplemental red spectrum LED? Will I need to adjust PPFD to account for the extra photon power? 1,000 watt LEDs, 2-gallon cocoa, auto drip system for irrigation. My goal is to encourage bulking and ripening.
All right. So we got a few things to chat about here with this one. And I'm going to share my screen. So hopefully
Yes, that would
Chris
be helpful.
can get us rocking and rolling. And I'll try to zoom in so we can actually kind of see this here.
I can read it on your laptop at least.
Perfect. Yes, here's the spectrum, the light spectrum. And here in the middle, we can see visible light spectrum. On the left side, ultraviolet radiation, so our blues and purples. What we're talking about now is on the right side here, infrared radiation and all of infrared radiation is considered far red. So
extend that black line up, and that's our area.
Yes. And so also what we have to think about is your PPFD sensor, right? And so when we're looking at sensors, and here I'm just referencing, let's see. All right, so here's a couple of popular sensors on the market. This purple line is shown with the black line. That's their rated specs for what wavelengths that this sensor looks at. This is called an EPAR sensor, and it's extended out here to 750, right? And their traditional quantum sensors showing sensitivity out to 700. So when we think about looking at far reds, we can see here that, all right, we've got infrared A and infrared B, and both of these are above what popular PPFD sensors are actually reading. So when we do start to implement some far red, it's probably not even going to show up on our PPFD sensors. So this is one thing to consider, that yes, we are giving the plants more photons. How are those photons reacting with the plant is going to be dictated by absorption charts. So this is an example of an absorption chart with showing our wavelengths down on the x-axis and light absorbance on the left. So how much the cells are absorbing it. And most of our older lights, we're typically where we're targeting most of our older LEDs, I should specify, they were targeting chlorophylls A and B photo absorptions, right? And so those are down around the 450 and a little bit of absorption up around that 700, 720, 740 range. And this is actually one of the reasons that older LEDs are blurple.
Yeah.
Was because one, those were a little bit cheaper diodes to produce, and those are targeting the ranges where chlorophyll A and B are max absorbance, right? So bang for the buck ways, that's why they were being produced that. Obviously, some of the material science technology progressions allowed for cheaper diodes to be produced of other colors. Having a more full spectrum allows us to enable these phytochromes to hit, these cryptochromes, carotenoids, those secondary metaboloids to really express the plant, if you will. Some of these are related or responsible for the chemical profiles in the plant, and that's directly going to show some of what we call quality, right? And obviously, as we get farther and farther down the topic of photomorphogenesis, the more it is important for us to think about playing with things like infrared A and infrared B. How do we modulate these? And probably even most importantly, what is their ratio in respect to the rest of the spectrum? I don't know your answer to your question, but I talked a lot about it.
So, I think what to take away from that is it's probably important to look at the specs on your light and figure out how much extra light that the far reds actually add, because you're not going to be able to pick it up necessarily with your handheld PPFD sensor. There are, I believe, a few models on the market that do push far red. Off the top of my head, I'm not sure how far they go. into the wavelengths. That being said, if you know you have a blind spot, but you can also get the quantity of extra light that is going to be put on when you switch the far reds on, you can compensate by turning your lights down just a little bit. If you're already running 1100 ppfd and the far red was going to give you another 300, you might want to back that down 10 or 20% and see where we're at, especially if we're looking at just the last 2 weeks during ripening. That being said, I myself and know plenty of growers that are experimenting with just leaving those far red lights on the whole time, because we're kind of trying to chase that Goldilocks spectrum that the HPS gave us. And, if you go just even look at a bunch of, I'm trying to think of some superstore where you can go see like 30 different LED panels and lights next to each other. But some of the more recent releases from almost any company are putting out a spectrum that's emphasizing the far red and really trying to produce that more red yellow light that we used to see out of the HPS, partially because we've already selected so many genetics under those for the past 30, 40 years. And it does push ultimately that quality that we're looking for. And just as Jason said, the technology is getting cheaper. Also, I want to say in the last several years, they've actually been able to make diodes that produce colors that they weren't capable of producing before in specific wavelengths. So we are seeing it fill in the gap. When we had the blurple lights, the market was also a little bit different too. You had your classic UFOs and stuff that are marketed at cannabis producers, but then you had companies like Philips selling lights to people who were growing spinach, lettuce, all these other, traditional indoor horticulture crops. And in those ones, that's what they're looking to target, is just that vegetative biomass, which is different than what cannabis producers need in terms of light spectrum.
Awesome, you guys. Thank you for that. Dom, I appreciate your question. We love to talk about lighting. All right. Well, before we wrap it up, we dropped in the chat a link to a new FAQ page with commonly asked office hours questions. If we never get to your question, if you don't have time to submit questions, pay that page a visit. Maybe we already answered it for you, and also links to a lot of our education guides. Not only that, we are thrilled to announce that Cannaviga is our official distributor in Europe. So we dropped that in the chat, as well as a link for you to go ahead and tap into that if you are in Europe. We're thrilled to be global. And then last but certainly not least, Arroyo is nominated for the MJ Awards Cultivation Software of the Year. That's because of you, Gromies. You dropped us in there, and we would appreciate it if you use the link we provide to vote for us once a day. We want to win that. We appreciate you for supporting us. All right, y'all, before we go, Seth, Jason, anything before we wrap up?
Have a great day.
Yeah. Keep it fun out there.
Thank you guys so much for a great show. Producer Chris, thank you for a great session. And thank you to all of you for joining us for this week's Arroyo Office Hours. To learn more about Arroyo, book a demo at arroyo.io, and our team will be happy to show you the ins and outs of the ultimate cannabis cultivation platform. If you have any crop steering or cultivation questions you want us to cover, drop them anytime in the Arroyo app. Email us at sales@arroyo.io. Send us a DM over Instagram, Facebook, or LinkedIn. We definitely want to hear from you. If you're a fan of the pod, leave us a review on Spotify, Apple Music, YouTube, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. We appreciate your feedback, and be sure to subscribe to our YouTube so you never miss an episode. Thanks, y'all. We'll see you in episode 117. Bye.